Okay, so today we're going to get started, and we're going to do exercise 106. And today's lecture will be slightly different. I only have a few slides to show because this is one of those topics that I struggle with the right way to explain it to you other than to make you actually do it with me live. And so I'm going to show you a couple examples. I'm going to talk through it, and then I'll actually sit down and try to have each of you follow me do a specific thing so that you learn this technique. We're going to talk today about something called blending modes in Photoshop. And what blending modes do is they basically control how we apply layers on top of layers. All right? And so I guess the analogy would be, let's say you had a drawing that you drew on a drafting board and you laid out a layer of white trace paper over it and you did something. Okay? Whatever you did would look different if you did that same trace on yellow tracing paper. Does that make sense? So depending on what technique we use, we get different results. And so I'm going to walk through and kind of explain that first, and then we'll actually do it live. So basically, this works very similar to adjusting the opacity of a layer, right? Which would be the same thing as changing how see-through the tracing paper is. Okay? The difference is that mathematically, it's doing something based on the top layer to the bottom layer. And so instead of just saying, this is how much we can see through it, it's saying, wait a minute, if something's darker, I want you to do this. If something's lighter, I want you to do that. So it's a little bit more sophisticated of how we're applying one layer to another layer. So Photoshop blending modes are divided into groups. And again, we're going to show you this. I'm going to explain where you find this menu. But these groups generally fall into certain categories. And the good news is that Photoshop categorizes like kinds together. The names of these don't necessarily mean anything or should mean anything. Some of them you just experiment around and see which one works better. But we have these different blending mode groups. Normal up here, these are just the standard, I want a layer on top of another layer and I want to see it as if it were just laying on top of it. These tend to darken the underlying image. These tend to lighten the underlying image, right? These tend to both lighten and darken and don't change anything in the middle. Right? And so the difference between lighten and screen and color dodge are subtle, but they're more of an experimentation. If we were professionals in this, or we spent the whole semester, maybe we'd dive into exactly what's happening. For us, we're going to look at what looks right and pick that one. Okay? So it's much more visual. And then these lower ones, there may have been a few more added depending on what version of Photoshop we're in, but they're a little bit more complicated, and they can be helpful in very specific circumstances. Okay, so the most common ones that we're going to use, certainly in the world of architecture, are the darkening, which would be multiply. Right? That's the most common. If we're going to lighten something, we're going to use screen. Right? And if we're down here in the contrast, almost always it's going to be overlay, but sometimes we use soft light. Right? The rest of them you can pretty much ignore, but we can still play around with them and you can see what they do. So let's try to go through a few illustrations of what blending modes are, and then we'll get to the live explanation. So basically what happens is we have two layers. We have a top layer and then we have a bottom layer. And the blending mode is always applied to this top layer. Right? So in this case, this is the example that you're all going to play around with today, and then we'll move into processing some photographs with it. We have a layer that has these images on it. Right? It has a black spot, it has a gray spot, and it has a white spot, and then it has a gradient that goes there. Behind it is a layer that's completely blue. Okay, so we're going to change the blending mode of the top layer, and it's going to change what the bottom layer looks like. Okay, so if we combine these together in its most basic format, this is what we're seeing. Right? Remember, the black, the gray, and the white, along with the gradient, are on top of the blue. So in normal mode, right, we're just seeing the black, the gray, and the white on top of the blue. The black, the gray, and the white completely cover up the blue, and we see nothing. Okay? If we move forward and we change the blending mode to be multiply on the top layer, right? So this top layer is going to be multiply. I'm going to show you what happens in just a second, right? The areas that are lighter, right, so the white area, are going to become transparent or semi-transparent. And the areas that are darker, the blacks and the dark grays, are going to become darker on the final layer. So what happens when we apply the blending mode, right, is that white becomes completely transparent. Right? The kind of medium gray becomes a little bit darker, right? And the things that were black become even blacker, okay, on the lower layer. And so this is the resulting image of a multiply blending mode. Same thing on a screen, right? Darker areas of the screen, this screen is basically the exact opposite of multiply. Okay, so the darker areas, the black things, are going to become transparent. The light things are going to become lighter. Okay, so if we see it actually happen, there we go. So these become transparent. This wasn't actually pure black. It's my mistake. But it gets much lighter, right? Medium is lighter, and white is very, very light. Okay, overlay is the same concept, except we're pinning the middle, that 50% gray as kind of the critical part. So the gray areas, right, become the transparent parts, and the black areas get blacker. The light areas get lighter. Okay, so we pin the gray. The gray becomes the transparent part. These get darker. These get lighter. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of what's going on. But in order to really understand it, you kind of have to see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the site. If you guys, while I'm switching, would pull up the exercise 106 page for today, because there's something you're all going to download from that page. Okay, so I have the exercise 106 page pulled up. And under this first part, part 1, I want you to download the sample file, this ps_blendingmodes.psd. You're going to right-click on it and say Save Link As, and you're going to save it to your flash drive, which I've already done. Okay. Then, unfortunately, on these computers, if we just double-click the file, it's going to open Photoshop CS3 instead of CS6. So we actually have to go to the Start menu, go to All Programs, and find the Adobe Design Standard CS6, and then open Photoshop CS6. Okay. Once I have Photoshop open, I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Open, and I'm going to pick that exercise 106 blending modes. Should look like this. Okay. So I'm gonna wait until everybody has this up, because we're going to go through this step by step together. Okay, so this is the kind of thing where we really have to do it together to start to explain why and how it works. So I have Photoshop open. I have my file open. Over here on my layers, we're going to ignore layer 2 and layer 3 for a little bit. I'll show you those in just a second so you can see a more architectural example of why this is important. But we're going to concentrate just on layer 1 and what's called the background. If I turn off layer 1, we can see that my background is all blue, right, which is essentially what I just showed in lecture. I also have the black, the gray, and the white with a transparent background. And so those are each on a separate layer. I'm going to be working with this layer 1 first, and this is where I'm going to apply the various blending modes and see what happens. Okay? So we're in part 1 of exercise 106. Right? The first one that I'm going to change to, with layer 1 selected here, I'm going to change my blending mode to multiply. And so the blending mode is located next to where it says opacity. It'll be a drop-down menu that says normal. Right? And if I click on where it says normal, we get this set of groups that are the blending modes. I'm going to specify multiply this time. And when I specify multiply, we're going to see that the white area right here becomes transparent. Right? The gray area becomes a little bit darker, and the black area becomes a lot darker. So essentially what it's doing is it's making anything on the page that is white transparent, and anything that's dark on the page dark. Okay? So if I switch this, again, layer 1, from multiply to screen, we get the inverse happening, right? Where the dark areas are becoming transparent, the medium areas are becoming a little bit lighter, and the light areas are becoming much lighter, right? Or in this case, white. Okay? Again, if I select layer 1 and I switch from screen to overlay, right? The medium, so that neutral color, becomes transparent. Things that are darker become darker. Things that are lighter become lighter. Right? And you can see that in contrast to the original background color. Okay? So how does this really play in for an architectural context? What I have, let me turn off my layer 1. I have the blue background still, but I have a JPEG output from SketchUp, right? It doesn't really matter what it is, right? But it's a little line drawing that's from SketchUp. SketchUp makes these relatively easily, but it has white as a backdrop, right, with black lines. Anybody output this from SketchUp before? Seems somewhat familiar, maybe? Okay. The problem here is that if I want something to be transparent, right, if I want it to just be a group of lines, I can't get that because it gives me the white background. So I'd like the white background to go away. Well, we just learned that there's a blending mode that will do that, right? So if I have this layer selected, right, and I change the blending mode from normal to multiply, right, it's going to make the white go away, and it's going to let the black shine through, right? It's actually going to darken the blue. Yeah. Okay. So I'm now working on layer 2. If I did the opposite, if I went to screen, right, the white is going to stay there, but it's going to let the background color leak through wherever the black is, right? So instead of having black lines, I now have blue lines, right? Different technique, different result. Okay? If I went from screen instead to overlay, right, I kind of have somewhere in between. Right? My background is becoming a little bit lighter. My blue lines are kind of coming through. This is not the most attractive, right? But it works. If I jump up to layer 3, I have the opposite. I have a bunch of white lines on a black background. Okay, I can work the same way through this. The natural tendency here would be to use screen, right? So if I jump down to screen, I'm going to get the white lines, right, shining through on a blue background. If I were instead to go to multiply, right, we keep the black background and the lines would become blue. You can't see it on the projector. Okay? And if I went and did overlay, right, I get some kind of a hybrid between the two. Right? So in the instance with the black background, in all likelihood, you're going to pick the screen mode to get the white lines to come through. And if I were doing the white background with the black lines, in all likelihood, I'd be using the multiply to let those dark lines come through. Okay? And I'm doing it all on a black backdrop, so that or on a blue backdrop, so that you can really see what's happening. The blue backdrop is completely arbitrary. It could be some other color. It could be a photograph. It could be a variety of things, and the same thing will happen. Actually, for interest's sake, let's go. I'm going to drop in, and this is not something you have to follow along with. I'm going to drop a photo in here just so that we can kind of see it. So let me go to, I'm going to go to File, Place, and I'm going to drop in a picture. Right? Again, it doesn't matter what the picture is, but I'm going to use this as an example. Right? So there's the picture. If this was normal, I'd have the white background with the black lines. If I wanted the picture to shine through, right, I'd switch into multiply mode. And now we see that the black lines are essentially transparent, or excuse me, the black lines are opaque, but everything that is white is transparent. We see through, we see the actual image. So you can see how easy this is to combine images together, right, using some carefully controlled techniques. Okay, so that's kind of the part 1 is understanding blending modes. And I wanted you guys to be able to play along with me and see what was happening. The other factor in this is that you're just going to spend a little bit of time playing around with it. I'm going to walk through some uses of blending modes in a more photographic sense, and then we'll move into these architectural ones toward the end of the semester when we start using SketchUp. So we'll come back and we'll use blending modes a lot more. I should also point out that blending modes right now, we're talking about it in Photoshop, but blending modes exist both in InDesign and in Illustrator, so you can use the same techniques down the road in the other Adobe products. So learning blending modes is important very much from the beginning. Okay? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example of using multiply to correct an old scanned faded photo. Chances are you don't have an old black and white photo just laying around on your flash drive, so you're probably going to need to do a search for one. I like to use the Creative Commons search, which is search.creativecommons.org. Right? And then you'll type in something of interest, and I usually pick Flickr as my search engine. And so it might be old photograph or something like that. And it'll bring up a variety of old photographs. What we're looking for is an older photograph that's faded, right? Something like this that's kind of faded out in the background, and we want to be able to enhance that photo. Which photo you pick is entirely up to you. If there's something specific that you're interested in, of course, pick that one. Try not to pick one that's already well exposed. Something like this is already pretty decent. Pick one that's not as good because we're going to try to correct it. Okay. I already have a couple on my flash drive, so I'm going to use one of those. From within Photoshop, I'm going to go to File and then Open. And I'm going to pick one. Right, so here's an example of an older faded photograph. Okay. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer. So just like we've done in the past, I'm going to use those techniques still as we go forward. So I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll go to Levels. Okay. There's that histogram that we saw last class. I'm just going to pull the black value over a little bit, which is going to darken up the image. So that by itself enhanced the image. Right? That made it better already. So this is where I was. Gives me a little bit more contrast, which helps. Okay, so you can see that difference already. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change, and instead of just applying this as a levels adjustment, I'm going to change the blending mode of this adjustment to be a multiply blending mode. Okay? And so now we can look at where I was to where I am. Look at all the detail up in the clouds. Right here you can barely see any of it. When we apply that adjustment layer, now we can see a lot of the detail up in the clouds. Okay? We have lost a little bit of detail down below, right? But this is the nature of the multiply blending mode. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save for web right now with multiply. So I'll go to File, Save for Web. Press Control-0. And then I'll go ahead and click Save. And so I have my original image, and I'm going to call this one Multiply. So I added an underscore multiply. I'll go ahead and click Save. I'll go ahead and click Replace. That's just because I've done it already. Okay, if this was a little bit strong, the other thing that I can do is after I've switched the blending mode to multiply, I can adjust right here where it says opacity, and I can drop the opacity down a little bit and fine-tune how strong I want this to be. So somewhere in the 70% actually is a little bit better than 100%. But again, you have some flexibility in terms of how you apply it. Okay? So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn this one off, and actually I'm going to rename this to be multiply, just for clarity. Okay? I'm going to do the same thing, only this time I'm going to do it with screen so I can see what happens. So I'll go up to Layer, I'll go to New Adjustment Layer, and I'll go to Levels. I'll say OK. And I'm going to pull my levels down, just like I did before. And then this time, instead of applying a multiply, I'm going to apply a screen. All right? So if I apply the screen mode, and let me go ahead and rename this screen. Right? If we look at this, the detail here in the foliage at the kind of the water's edge is significantly better. Right? I can even zoom in and we can see it a little bit better here. Right? So I'm getting a lot more detail in this area of the photo that I didn't get in the multiply. See, in the multiply, everything got darker. Right? In the screen mode, everything gets a little bit lighter, and I get a lot more detail in this section of the photo, which is pretty good. As a side effect, however, I lose almost all of the clouds in the sky. Right? So in the multiply example, we got a great view of the sky, clouds in the sky and kind of what that looked like. In the screen, we got great information about what's happening down here in the foliage. So we're getting one or the other, but we're not getting both. And so in an ideal world, we'd rather have both. But before I move on, I'm going to go ahead and save the screen version of this. So I'll go to File, Save for Web. And let me go ahead and click on Save. And I'm going to call this _screen. And I'll click Save. And again, I'm having to replace the files because I've already done this once. Perfect. So now I have a screen and I have a multiply. Let's turn them both off, and this time I'm going to do an overlay. And you can see where I'm kind of leading up to, right? Obviously, the overlay is going to be enhancing the darks in the image, and it's going to be enhancing the lights in the image. So let's see how it works. Once again, I'll go up to Layer. I'll go to New Adjustment Layer, Levels. I'll say OK. I'll pull this down a bit. And then this time, let me rename it. This is going to be Overlay. This time, I'm going to take this and change the blending mode to Overlay. And when I do that, I'm lightening the light areas of the image and darkening the dark areas of the image. And so we'll adjust this opacity a bit to what looks about right. Okay? And it's hard because on the projector you're not seeing the sky detail and you're not seeing the ground detail. But we're getting a decent result here. Okay? So once I have it like this, we'll go ahead and go to File, Save for Web. Yes. Press Ctrl-0, and I'll go ahead and click Save, and I'll name this _overlay. So what I've chosen to do in this example for you is each photo I'm doing with each of these, right? In reality, when you're working on it, I'd encourage you to pick your own photos, right? Pick a different photo. You don't have to pick the same one for Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4, right? You can pick any of them that you want. When we get to Part 5, which is going to be a different kind of setup, I actually don't want you to pick an old photo. I want you to pick a photo that has a lot of saturation of color, hopefully something with a lot of reds in it, right? Because that's where you're going to see a result. So on these, you're working probably with an older image. If you choose to use the same one for each, like I just did, that's fine. If you want to pick a different one for each blending mode, that's okay too. Okay, it's really up to you. So when we get to Part 5, like I said, I want something with a little bit more saturation. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File and then Open. And I'm going to pick one of these that you've seen before that has a bunch of color in it, a bunch of sunset color, etc. And I'm going to do something a little bit different in trying to bring out the color and give just a little bit better punch to this particular image. Okay? So again, I'm looking for something with lots of reds or lots of blues in it because that's where I'm going to be able to pull it out. I'm going to create a curves adjustment layer this time. So I'll go up to Layer. I'll go to New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to go to Curves. And I'm going to set up a traditional S curve for this photo. Right, so I'm going to click a point right in the center to pin that center. And then I'm going to slightly pull up the lights and slightly pull down the darks. Something like that. So again, subtle enhancement there. There it is. Let's see it a little bit, pulling out a little bit more of the color. Okay. Now I'm going to change the blending mode on this curves to be something further down here called luminosity. It's at the very bottom, right? And what that does is and on the screen it's always going to be very difficult for you to see. It just pulls out the colors a little bit differently. And if we see the original one, I don't know the best way to describe this, other than you can see it better on your screen when you do it. But the colors are a little bit more muted, and there's not quite as much contrast between them. This really pulls out the little bit of darkness that's in the clouds, and it gives just a little bit more punch to that image. Right? So it's subtle, but you have to kind of play around with it to see it yourself. Okay? So I know I'm dumping a lot on you, right? But these are all, again, dealing with blending modes. Right? And of course, I'm going to come around and help all of you individually. But we're going to keep going. You see there's a back. There's a lot of parts to this exercise. Right? The next part is that we're going to add a grunge background texture to an image. And you can choose what image you want to have this applied to, but this shows you that you can really transform it. One of the things that happens with these images a lot of times is we think of them as we're just making post-processing on this one image, and it's going to look a certain way, and we're going to get it to a certain, oh, it's really good. But sometimes adding a little bit of dust or a little bit of dirt to the image can really enhance it or give it a little bit more grain. And so depending on what your image, maybe I wouldn't pick a sunset image. Maybe I'd pick something that was a little bit more, an abandoned building or something to do this. But if you want to add a little bit more, you can put what's called a grunge texture behind it. Basically, it's some dirt behind it. If we do a Google search for grunge texture, right, you're going to see a bunch of examples, right? And it's things like this that have like ink stains or chalkboards or dirt on a concrete wall or something like that. I guess we probably should do a Creative Commons search so that we can find one that we're licensed to use, hopefully that's big enough. So let me go grunge. Right, and so we can kind of look through here. Some of them are ink stains, right? Here's a coffee stain. I'll use this one for right now. It doesn't matter which one you pick, right? But this will be a good illustration of it. I want to download this image, so I'm going to click on this little download the photo icon, and I want to go to the original size. And I'll put it on my flash drive. Go ahead and copy it. Jump over to my flash drive. Now, in my resources folder on my flash drive, I tend to keep a folder that has things like grunge textures in it. And I'll go ahead and paste this in. I should also point out, while that's pasting, that on the Digital Tools site, there are some textures that you can download. So if I go to Digital Tools and I go to Resources, Downloadable Resource Packages, right down here, we can download a zip archive of grunge textures. So these are a bunch of ones that I've collected over time. You can download those as well. It's actually a Dropbox link, so you have to click on it and then go to download. And it's a little bit larger, 216 megabytes. So you can spend a little bit of time letting that download. Anyway, since I already have the one from Flickr, I'm going to use that one first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File and then Place. And basically what File Place does is it says, go find an image and drop it into my scene. Okay, so if I go to File Place, it's going to ask me where is this image that I want. It's right up here. That long string of numbers typically is a Flickr image. I'll go ahead and click on Place. And that was definitely not my image. We don't need that one. Let's try that again. We go to File Place. And there it is. All right, and so I get this image with the little coffee stains. It's significantly smaller than my actual image, so I need to make it bigger. I'm going to use, you see how it has an X across it, and it has little handles in each corner? When I move over one of the handles, I get a double arrow, which is going to allow me to make this image larger. As I click and drag, you can see that I can skew the image. I can actually flip it over on itself. Right? If I want it to stay proportionally correct, I can hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, and it will grow proportionally. And so I'll go from one corner and then from the other corner, and I end up in that vein. Okay? So now I have my background image, right, that happens to have my luminosity adjustment applied, but I also, right, have this coffee stain, and I want the coffee stain, right, to impact the image that's below it. So I'm going to play around with the blending modes to see which one does what I want it to do. So I'll start with the image highlighted here, and I'll move to multiply. And if I go to multiply, we can see that that stain is really dominating the image. Right? Maybe it's a little bit too strong. I can adjust the opacity here, and we can see that it's adding a little bit of texture behind it. Right? Let's try, instead of multiply, let's try screen. And if we look at screen, right, depending on the level of opacity, right, we're getting some of the image shining through. Again, very different effect. Okay? Let's try overlay. right? And this is, we're getting a combination of the two here, right? And depending on our value, we're going to get more or less of that stain showing through. Okay? And so this stain might not be the right example, but I'm trying to show you that you can combine images in this manner. Right? The other thing that I would encourage you to do when you get to this stage is to actually play around with some of the other options. Right? And you can see what they do. Right? So let's say I do color burn. Right? We get a very different result than multiply. Right? And so we're not going to spend time on each and every one of these. Right? The typical ones are going to be multiply, screen, overlay, and then we'll get to soft light. There's a very specific instance where we'll use that later in the semester. But the rest of these, I would just encourage you to go through and say, what do they do? Right? Which one looks right? Right? And you can kind of see as you go through that each one does something different. Right? And you get different results. So that was with this particular texture. If you pick a different texture, a crinkled paper or something, you can get a very different result. So let's do that one just for fun. Let me go back. Maybe something like this. Download the original here. And I'll put it on my flash drive. Oops. And then we go to File and then Place. There it is. Again, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to hold down Shift as I do it. Like this. And then we'll change the multiply again. Right? And that, to me, is still very, very strong. So I'm going to adjust that temperature down just a little bit, or the opacity. And you can see that I'm getting the striping of that. So the point is that you can get some kind of a texture behind your image that makes it not quite as stark of an image. And we'll actually use this later on in the world of Illustrator, because we have such strong vector graphics that are just a solid color. We can get just a little bit more texture out of something like this behind it. And so we'll use the same technique when we get there. Okay, so today you're going to go through. It's a total of 18 images, I believe. Though if you do the same image for part 2, 3, and 4, you'll cut down a little bit. The point is we always want an original image of whatever you do, and then we want the processed image. Okay? So so let's see, we've got 2, 4, 6, or 4, depending on how many you do. Luminosity will be the original and the one with the luminosity. Right? And then the screen with the grunge background, right, will be one image. I use multiply. You could use screen too. It just depends on what looks right. Right? I say to use screen, but whatever looks right to you is good. When you post your work, you're going to do the same thing that you did last class, right, where you post the gallery. So you upload all the images at once. And so I'm not going to go through that again because you all did it. But if you have trouble doing it, we'll go through it, right, on an individual basis. Does anybody have any questions about what a blending mode is and what it's doing, or what results you can get? No? Okay. So I'll turn you loose. If you have questions, please call me over, and we'll walk through it.